what I have distributed is a French copy, the original copy, of a text that Maurice Blanchot wrote for his friend Robert Antelme in 1990, excuse me. So this would have been 3 years after the death of Robert Antelme. And what I'd like to try to do this evening with you is try to bring out the significance of this text, or at least some of the meaning of it. I find it quite remarkable, and it's remarkable in itself, but I think it's particularly astonishing if one reads it in the light of some of Blanchot's earlier work. In fact, it's so surprising that I find myself asking how it's possible he could have written this. So what I would like to do to try to give you a sense of this question that I have is start with reference to an earlier text that's almost canonical with regard to Blanchot's understanding of the role of commemoration and also friendship. And I'm referring here to an essay that was written after the passing of Georges Bataille, entitled Friendship, l'amitié. I would say, after reading L'Amitié, my first impression is that this essay, Friendship, l'amitié, would seem to exclude the gesture made in the later essay, which I have photocopied for you. So that one is Dans la nuit, surveillée. I'll be reading it in English. I'll read a translation. But it's so surprising that, to read this late one about Antelme after the Bataille that one has the impression it's not possible. It's that the Bataille essay would have excluded it. But if we look carefully at the Bataille essay, I think it's actually possible to see that it indicates a kind of threshold for the step that Blanchot makes. And it's a big step. Okay, I'll enter into my text and say that l'amitié, which, as we can see almost immediately when we read the text, did not seek to commemorate or to preserve somehow in memory the man or the friendship that had bound Maurice Blanchot to him. Indeed, we might say that it was written to preserve the man and the friendship from the appropriation of memory or any historicizing approach. There could be no witness to the excessive truth of this now disappearing existence, Blanchot wrote, no matter how veridical the testimony. The void that marked it, that gave it, would always escape. Only in friendship could the immensity of this passing be known, and this friendship was itself destined to effacement. So I'll begin by quoting in its entirety the opening of this astounding statement, written for Georges Bataille. How could one agree to speak of this friend? Neither in praise nor in the interest of some truth. The traits of his character, the forms of his existence, the episodes of his life, even in keeping with the search for which he felt himself responsible to the point of irresponsibility, belong to no one. There are no witnesses. Those who were closest say only what was close to them, not the distance that affirmed itself in this proximity, and distance ceases as soon as presence ceases. Vainly do we try to maintain with our words, with our writings, what is absent. Vainly do we offer it the appeal of our memories and a sort of figure, the joy of remaining with the day, life prolonged by a truthful appearance. We are only looking to fill a void. We cannot bear the pain, the affirmation of this void. Who could agree to receive its insignificance, an insignificance so enormous that we do not have a memory capable of containing it, and such that we ourselves must already slip into oblivion in order to sustain it, for the time of this slippage, into the very enigma this insignificance represents? Everything we say tends to veil the one affirmation, that all must fade, and that we can remain loyal only so long as we watch over this movement that fades, to which something in us that rejects all memory already belongs. That's the end of the first paragraph. I want to read that last sentence to you in French because I will be picking up traits of it. Tout ce que nous disons ne tend qu'à voiler l'unique affirmation, que tout doit s'effacer, everything must fade, et que nous ne pouvons rester fidèles qu'en veillant, watching over, qu'en veillant sur ce mouvement qui s'efface, auquel quelque chose en nous qui rejette tout souvenir appartient déjà. So Blanchot begins, as we've just heard, with a refusal that defends. The existence of the individual that has passed belongs to no one. And whether or not the implicit admonition to those closest is directed in some specific way, it clearly extends to any gesture that would seek to appropriate or say the inappropriable, which was surely a temptation for Blanchot himself. What was there, Blanchot insists, even as absence, is no longer there. The distance in Georges Bataille's inestimable presence, of which Maurice Blanchot would speak elsewhere so eloquently in describing the way it was harbored in his language, is declared here to have ceased. The passing is irrevocable. The event itself exceeds our hold and renders vain any effort to contain or supplement the void with memory or some figure, however lifelike or apparently veridical this prolonging fiction might be. Any effort to hold back something from this absenting only serves to avoid, in fact, its insistence, l'affirmation de ce vide, the affirmation of this void. But who, Blanchot continues, could face this presence of an absence, this incessant cessation, given the immeasure of its insignificance? No remembrance can hold this void that only forgetting, if we could accept such a thing, for it contains the forgetting of ourselves, could bear in the time of a furtive slippage carrying us into the heart of its enigma. The meaning of this passing is exorbitant, and anything we could say would obscure what Blanchot terms the one affirmation, an affirmation that necessarily exceeds Blanchot's own phrasing of it. And I quote again, that all must fade, que tout doit s'effacer, and that we can remain loyal only so long as we watch over this movement that fades, ce mouvement qui s'efface, to which something in us that rejects all memory already belongs. Blanchot's statement will go on to suggest what it meant to watch over, veiller sur, the movement of effacement, already in Bataille's lifetime. Friendship, he says, dictated a discretion founded on a fundamental distance that measured everything between them. This discretion, extending quite beyond the mere reserve that would render any divulgence regarding the person unthinkable, did not inhibit communication, Blanchot insists. Rather, it brought the two, Blanchot and Bataille, into what he would come to call an infinite conversation. To watch over meant to preserve an entente, and to maintain, here, entretenir, the movement of the conversation. But this discretion was always shaped by awareness of awaited it and what it would become, which Blanchot names abruptly in the course of his meditation, the fissure of death. At this end term, the furtive, imminent presence to which discretion always answered gave way to a radical effacement of the separation that held in relation, a dissipation of the distance between from which there could be no return. Even his own presence, Blanchot notes, would suffer this last inexorable effacement. Thus, his concluding paragraph will underscore again in this essay, L'Amitié, that however tempting recollection and some figuration of what has passed might be, this restorative gesture will remain vain. To watch over during the life of the friendship meant to preserve a speech and a silence. After the closing of this relation, there was nothing more than accompanying this friendship into forgetting, as Blanchot puts it at the end of his commemorative statement. In sum, there was no recalling to life by any figuration what had spoken in Georges Bataille's existence. What is passing left to thought, to the extent that something of the reflective thought that belonged to this friendship could itself survive, however briefly, was no more than the enigma to which this passing in its measureless insignificance pointed, that all must give way to effacement. Tout doit s'effacer. All must fade. It is a phrase so simple in appearance, so transparently receivable, that it could be passed along and over as a kind of common wisdom. But it points to something more than a necessity or a destiny, as we learn almost immediately in the succeeding clause, which is the last sentence of that paragraph. For this necessity becomes in human existence an exigency that shapes the meaning of friendship and fidelity for the fact that something in us belongs to this movement. So be it. But does the exigency of watching over the finitude of being from the ground of human finitude, and what the latter dictates in the way of accompaniment, somehow direct us toward the possibility of the gesture Blanchot will make in his text on Anton? Has the interdiction of any figuration or semblance of a dialogue not, in fact, prohibited such a gesture in relation to the departed one? And I'll be getting to the Anton text shortly, but you'll see clearly that what he's doing there is quite different from what he has declared here with Bataille. My rapid and somewhat brutal translation of effacement with finitude will signal the level and the extent of questioning required here, which is both existential and ontological. And clearly, we are left with a forbidding question as to what Blanchot might mean by the term veiller, to watch over, not to mention surveiller, which is in the title of the Anton text, which I have translated as watching over, and which offers an important link between the two commemorative texts under consideration. What might it mean to watch over effacement? And what survival in and of thought was implied by this exigency? To approach this immense question, I want to consider briefly with you a few of the steps Blanchot takes in the period between the two statements, and I propose to focus primarily on the term effacer, since it is from this term that he will think the task of watching. With the term effacer, which is translated in English as fade, as you've noticed, but literally it would be efface. With this term, however, I must back up a little bit in Blanchot's text, because the fact is that Blanchot had already drawn extensively on the term in his critical writings by the time he had published his commemorative statement for Bataille. Effacer works quietly throughout Blanchot's text, but it is a fundamental term. It is, as we have already seen in the statement on Bataille's passing, a virtual synonym for dying. And many of you will know that in l'espace littéraire, the term is used for the passage from je to il that characterizes the writing experience. But the term also names, in an important text from the same period in Blanchot's critical thinking, the condition of the image. As Blanchot writes in two versions of the Imaginary, I quote, "The image needs the neutrality and the effacement of the world," end quote. So you will see already the basis for my earlier suggestion that the term effacement has both an existential and ontological reach. But there is a further point I must make in this very hasty sketch of the meaning of this term in Blanchot's earlier work, for effacement is a condition that can only be received in affirmation. Hence the unforgettable declaration by the narrating voice near the beginning of La Folie du Jour, which runs as follows: "Ce jour s'effaçant, je m'effacerai avec lui." When this day fades, I will fade along with it. To assume the exigency of effacement is to affirm effacement. And this is ultimately because effacement opens onto being's incapacity to negate itself. Needless to say, the topic of effacement calls for a study of its own, and at this point I can only offer a promissory note as I move on to the interim between the commemorative address for Bataille and the statement for Anton. I note that the phrase we read in the first essay, tout doit s'effacer, everything must fade, is one that will recur in Blanchot's writings. In fact, the Blanchotians in this group will recognize it from Blanchot's famous letter to Laporte of 1984. But I want to turn here to its appearance in Le Pas au-delà from 1973, which is of particular interest for us on this occasion, I think. The passage in question does not define watching over, but it does describe one response to the exigency of effacement. So I quote again Le Pas au-delà. This is one of the fragments. "Everything must give way to effacement. Everything will efface itself." In French, tout doit s'effacer. tout s'effacera. It is in accord with the infinite exigency of effacement that writing takes place and has its place. These words are then followed by a kind of dialogue, which follows immediately in the text in another fragment. Even if writing leaves traces, and in leaving them makes it so that traces are engendered or produced out of the life of traces, one can answer, to write is to go by way of the world of traces toward the effacement of traces, and of all traces, since traces are opposed to totality and always already disperse themselves. End quote. So, writing, Blanchot tells us, meets the infinite exigency of effacement and thereby finds its place. The ground for this accord, however, remains elusive inasmuch as writing is normally understood as perduring in its traces and calls, in the obscurity of these traces that outlive or simply exceed any order of meaning, for further writing. This multiplication would hardly seem to serve the exigency of effacement. But a possible answer is offered with an account of writing that is in keeping with Blanchot's unfolding reflections on fragmentation in the period to which Le Pas au-delà belongs. Writing, the possible interlocutor offers, engages the dispersive character of the trace. Derrida would call this dissemination. Its resistance to any gathering in meaning in such a way as to approach the suspension of presentation that belongs to what Blanchot terms le neutre. To write would be to approach the neutral of effacement. Or perhaps better, it would be to approach le neutre in its guise of effacement. We see again, in any case, that tout s'efface, tout doit s'effacer, does not refer to the inexorable character of time to which everything must submit, or not simply. It names a disruption in time that compromises any horizontal offering by which we would have a relation to history or to passing to mortality in general. This disrupts the horizon of time from which there might be an understanding of being. It's a disruption of time. This disruption would undermine from the start the formation of the tout, the whole, that we may now hear in tout doit s'effacer, the order gathered by a logos or a memory. Where writing engages effacement, then, the horizon of all legibility is effectively breached, fragmented, and effaced. The order of meaning and appearance is scattered, leaving an excessive insignificance in a neutral, interrupted space where the very meaning of exigency is shaken, no less than that of the freedom of the one who undertakes to answer. It is in this space that thought, I quote, must struggle with the invisible, where everything falls back into indifference, as Blanchot put it in his essay on Bataille. But it will also be apparent now that indifference is not the mere absence of those differential relations ordered by the negative, and thus ultimately the dialectic. The affirmation of the void holds something else for thought. It calls to another form of relation. This other relation is undoubtedly related to something we heard in the direct declaration of the narrating voice of La Folie du Jour, the madness of the day. In that text, as we have seen, effacement is given an epical or quasi-messianic meaning, and a narrating subject that has evidently suffered a form of disaster that is linked to a madness in the day itself, effacement then at the level of the truth of the whole, le tout, is moved to envision a recurrence of this disaster that he is prepared to affirm. Indeed, we hear more than affirmation in his declaration. We hear the evocation of an act. Ce jour s'effaçant, je m'effacerai avec lui. And when this day fades, I will go with it. It is an astonishing declaration that requires long consideration, but it will at least alert us here to the fact that while Blanchot's notion of writing invites to an extreme of passivity, it also points to an affirmative turn that we will again encounter in Blanchot's text on Antenne. Following the reference to writing opened by the passage we have considered in Le Pas au-delà, we may perhaps now approach a still later passage in L'écriture du désastre from 1980, The Writing of the Disaster, wherein Blanchot contrasts a construction of a relation to death through the work of psychoanalysis, for example, that seeks escape from its undefined menace, with a writing that allows what in us belongs to effacement. On the one hand, a construction of death that protects us against effacement, and the other, a kind of writing that opens to effacement. Again, we see a reference to an active exception comparable to the je m'effacerai, I will fade along with it, of La Folie du Jour. I'm quoting, I'm moving into some famous material here. This is, again, a passage from The Writing of the Disaster. Dying means you are dead already, in an immemorial past, of a death which was not yours, which you have thus neither known nor lived, but under the threat of which you believe you are called upon to live. You await it henceforth in the future, constructing a future to make it possible at last, possible as something that will take place and will belong to the realm of experience. To write, this is the other alternative, so to speak, to write is no longer to situate death in the future, the death which is always already past. To write is to accept that one has to die without making death present and without making oneself present to it. To write is to know that death has taken place even though it has not been experienced, and to recognize it in the forgetfulness that it leaves, in the traces which, effacing themselves, call upon one to accept oneself from the cosmic order, and to abide where the disaster makes the real impossible and desire undesirable. End quote. The discussion in The Writing of the Disaster that follows this paragraph identifies the dimension of experience to which we are exposed by our finitude as what Blanchot calls the impossible necessary death. A dying that thought bears in it, and that even bears it, but which cannot be received except in a form of forgetting. Blanchot's pages will focus on conceptual tools offered by psychoanalysis, the motif of a dying infans, offered by Winnicott and Leclerc, and by the Hegelian dialectic, emphasizing that this death cannot be assumed by the concept, whose movement can only reiterate or remark, despite itself, the exigency of this death. But some figuration, Blanchot tells us, a fictive relation of singularity is nonetheless essential to speech and life. Some fiction is required by a movement of effacement that Blanchot links to an effacement in time itself. And here again I quote from a famous passage which I myself have read extensively, but there's something here that I want to return to. This is you might say, the theoretical account of the dying of the infants, which comes immediately before the primal scene. A child already dead is dying by a murderous death, a child of whom we know nothing except this, that the possibility of speaking and of life depend on the fictive establishment through death and murder of a relation of singularity with a mute past, with a prehistory, with a past then which is outside the past and of which the eternal infans is the figure at the same time that he is concealed therein. A child is being killed. He's quoting Leclerc's phrase. A child is being killed. Let us make no mistake about this present. It signifies that the operation could never take place once and for all, that it is not accomplished at any privileged moment of time, that it operates inoperably and thus tends to be none but the very time that destroys or effaces time. An effacement or a destruction or a gift that has always already avowed itself in the precession of a saying outside any said. A work of writing whereby this effacement, far from effacing itself in its turn, is perpetuated without term, even in the interruption that constitutes its mark. End quote. So, on tue un enfant, a child is being killed, that phrase from Leclerc, is presumably a fictive saying that meets the necessity Blanchot identifies for speech and life, and would bring to language a forever prior saying that will have already avowed the event of effacement itself. This fictive saying, on tue un enfant, is in turn destined to a form of effacement, if ever it is brought to sound, Blanchot tells us. But in its extreme insufficiency and obscurity, it nonetheless relays what is at once destruction and a gift that opens the possibility of survival itself, which can be understood as an acquiescent assumption, an affirmation of effacement. To survive, Blanchot adds, is to watch and to wait. And I'm quoting here from a passage near the end of The Writing of the Disaster, which returns to the primal scene which he has been approaching with those theoretical words that I quoted. I quote then from the end of L'écriture du désastre. What does to survive mean then, if not to live and in and by acquiescence to refusal, in the exhaustion of emotion, withdrawn from any interest in oneself, disinterested, extenuated to a state of utter calmness, expecting nothing? Consequently, waiting and watching, for suddenly wakened, and, knowing this full well henceforth, never wakeful enough. So, I've tried to link the terms effacement, survival, watching over, surveillée. These hardly constitute a bridge to the brief text on Anthem, but they hint, I believe, at its possibility. The possibility inheres in a term that was noticeably absent from the meditation on Bataille's passing and its meaning for the relation of friendship, and that would be writing, which I would now describe as the writing of a form of fiction. To watch over the movement of effacement in the essay for Bataille entailed refusing the temptation of any revivifying figuration, any appeal to semblance, by a dialogue, for example, in the name of the strictest possible understanding of loss. But Blanchot's meditation on the exigency that lies in effacement, the exigency that gives writing its place, directs him not just to another sense of responsibility pertaining to friendship, but to the assertion of a right that bears on fiction. Let me thus turn to this text now and attempt to approach its singular movement. So I'm going to read it now in English, and you have the French in front of you if you want to refer to it. It's a text that can sort of fool us by its simplicity. It's very simple and direct, but extremely complicated. In the night that is watched over them. It is slowly, in those nights when I sleep without sleeping, that I became conscious, this word is inappropriate, of your proximity, which is distant nonetheless. I persuaded myself that you were here. Not you, but this repeated phrase, I am going far away, I am going far away. I immediately understood that Robert, so generous, so little concerned about himself, was not speaking to me about or for himself, but of all the places of extermination, of which, if it was him speaking, he listed a few. Listen to them. Listen to the names. Treblinka, Chelmno, Belchek, Majdanek, Auschwitz, Sobibor, Birkenau, Ravensbrück, Dachau. But I say speaking, not speaking. Do we forget? Yes, you forget. You forget all the more for remembering. Your memory does not impede you from living, from surviving, nor even from loving me. But one does not love a dead person, because then the meaning escapes you, the impossibility of meaning, the non-being and impossibility of non-being. When I reread these lines, I know that I have already lost sight of Robert Antin, the incomparable friend I knew. He was so simple, and at the same time so rich, with a knowledge that the greatest minds lacked. In the experience of servitude that was his, even if he shared it with others, he kept the human truth from which he knew not to exclude even those who oppressed him. But he went even further. Not recognizing a companion, Kay, he had come to see in the infirmary, who was still alive, he understood that there is a nothingness in life itself, an unfathomable void against which one has to defend oneself, even while acknowledging its approach. We must learn to live with this void. We will maintain plenitude even in nothingness. This is why, Robert, I still have my place next to you. And this night watched over, in which you come to see me, is not an illusion where everything would disappear, but my right to make you live, even in the void I feel approaching. We have seen in L'écriture du désastre the phrase, a child is being killed was offered as an impossible saying of effacement. In Dans la nuit surveillée, in the night that is watched over, something comparable is offered, though the words emerge from a friendship sinking into forgetting and call to something like its accompaniment. These words that come in the night of a sleep deprived of sleep do not mark the presence of Anselm. They indicate rather his absenting. There is a nearness of the phrase itself, we are told, but it is given in a removed proximity, and the phrase in its very repetition effectively says effacement. We could say that an uncertain identification, I persuaded myself, is brought into focus, I understood immediately, with a firm link to Robert Anselm. But this identification is given only to cede immediately to another naming. The je of the phrase effaces itself in its repetition to allow or even to insist upon the hearing of the names of the camps enumerated. Listen to these names again, the voice says. They are slipping away. Perhaps they have never been recalled more powerfully. And this is precisely what seems to shock the narrating voice who pursues a dialogue without speech. Are we forgetting? It asks. The je, marked in the first paragraph, is now replaced by a more anonymous nous. Yes, you forget, comes the answer. You forget all the more for remembering, and by a memory that allows you to survive and preserve your love for me. And then the incredible words, but one does not love a dead person. Is this not, in fact, the lesson given in the essay on Bataille? Have the self-effacing words, je m'éloigne, I'm going away, in their very becoming anonymous, have these words not recalled the narrator to what Blanchot described in the earlier text as, I quote, an insignificance so unmeasured that we do not have a memory capable of containing it? One can love, certainly, but then one has lost the meaning of death or non-being, which is the very impossibility of meaning or the impossibility of non-being. One has failed the more severe imperative of watching over effacement. Here, however, and this is crucial to our larger discussion, the effacement belongs to our relation to history itself, to what Robert Anselm's experience gave of a relation to the immemorial of those names. Anselm's je m'éloigne effectively echoes je m'efface as a statement about history, while reiterating the impossible of the imperative to which Blanchot gave insistent attention in the 1980s and thereafter. Don't forget. Je m'éloigne says the fact of history thought from effacement, and this enjoins the impossible task of watching over, I quote, that for which there is no memory, but which is always, in one way or another, and always in anguish, the immemorial. From here, or rather from an indeterminate temporal passage that is marked by a subsequent reading of the dialogue that has preceded. As you see in the text, he's reading his past lines. The narrator, or the one we may now recognize as a writer, knows his blinding. I'll refer to this narrating figure henceforth as Blanchot, recognizing that this identification cannot be taken simply for granted. Robert Anselm will already have been lost to sight. The words that follow thus come in a tone of lament that is conveyed by the past tense, the incomparable friend that I knew, and then the delicacy of the following phrase, he was so simple. But the sober awareness of losing from sight this friend, this sobriety of the day, so to speak, appears to allow another form of statement which is itself sobering in the directness of its prose. Here, Blanchot refers to the teaching of l'espèce humaine, Anselm's book, a teaching not easily summarized, particularly in light of two important essays Blanchot devoted to it, but which I will restate following Blanchot's own rapid evocation of it with the following, that even the oppressor cannot escape the indestructible element of the human relation which they seek to destroy, and that this very violence brings to the fore. Anselm's wisdom was such that he was able to draw forth the human truth of this unfathomable, indestructible ground of human relation, affirming it against the efforts of the oppressor and refusing to deny it even to that oppressor. But Blanchot adds another step to what his meditation on Antelme had already brought forth regarding the burden of the ethical relation. Or to put this more precisely, he draws out something that his meditation on the indestructible revealed about the human truth to which he refers, namely that what is proper to the human is exposure to an abyss, an inhuman that can never be appropriated. The point is illustrated with reference to an incident recounted in L'Espèce Humaine, in which Antelme finds himself unable to recognize a dying friend. Here is an exposure to effacement in perhaps its most terrible form, because the other, K, presents in his unrecognizability an unfathomable void, a nothing that attends life itself. Blanchot's brief evocation of this encounter in the text we are reading is powerful in itself. But it is noteworthy that for the republication of Blanchot's text in a collective volume published by Gallimard in 1996, Blanchot requested that the relevant pages from Antelme's L'Espèce Humaine be reprinted next to his statement. It is as though Blanchot's simple account of the lesson of that passage about Antelme not being able to recognize his friend, as though Blanchot's simple account of the lesson of that passage could not be enough, that Antelme's own written testimony was required for the saying of this exposure Blanchot sought to recall. Such a saying was required, we might presume, for the passage Blanchot makes to the statement of the imperative and the affirmation with which this paragraph concludes. I'm referring to Blanchot's text. What did the passage regarding Antelme's visit to the infirmary underscore or reinforce in Blanchot's meditation? To begin to answer this question, I believe it is crucial to recognize that Blanchot understands L'Espèce Humaine as something other than a form of historical testimony. Twice he refuses this word in his earlier commentary on his book. He says, this is not testimony, this is a different kind of writing. It is rather a rendering of the experience of the camps, Blanchot says, in what he terms a just or a true speech. L'Espèce Humaine, for Blanchot, thus brings to its writing a hospitable word that receives the unknown or the foreign, that is humankind, when it is exposed as that ever-receding limit Blanchot names the indestructible. I follow Blanchot's reading of Lévinas in asserting that only such a hospitable word can transmit what I have called a teaching, in referring to L'Espèce Humaine. Citing L'Espèce Humaine in the republication of Dans la nuit surveillée, in that later Gallimard publication, Blanchot has implicitly deferred to this hospitable word, opening again to the questioning it bears and the exigency it transmits. I say opening again because it is difficult not to hear in the scene from the infirmary multiple, if muffled echoes of what had been written in Dans la nuit surveillée. Whether or not Blanchot intended such an echoing, and it is hard to imagine he did not recognize it, it is evident that Antelme's account somehow implicated Blanchot. He too, as we have read, had been visited at his bedside by Robert Antelme. And he too, but the roles are reversed now, was forced to acknowledge that he had lost his friend from sight. Neither the visit by night, where Antelme gives voice to his effacement in visiting Blanchot's sleep without sleep, nor the awareness of the day conveyed in the two paragraphs of reflection can be strictly correlated with the scene in the infirmary, even if Antelme's last words to Kay bring their own terrible echo. Bonsoir, mon vieux, he had said, acknowledging his friend's departure into the night. But it seems evident that Blanchot has somehow received the words of Antelme's account, or has been received by them, in such a way that a teaching and an exigency have formed for him. This encounter, transmitted in these words, calls for its translation. What Antelme learned or understood in that encounter becomes a lesson for Blanchot and an imperative. And so I quote again, we must learn to live with this void. We will maintain plenitude, even in nothingness. I believe we have heard something of this imperative in the pages from the writing of the disaster cited earlier. There, it will be recalled, Blanchot contrasts a refusal or avoidance of the impossible necessary death with an acceptance of it via writing and the reception of the exigency it brings. To accept oneself from the sidereal order and to open onto the vacant night of what he terms le désastre. Here, Blanchot actually performs that acceptance with the astonishing words, "We will maintain plenitude, even unto nothing." Plenitude is not a very Blanchotian word, and I will not try to do more than underscore its enigma. But I want to stress how the acceptance or the acquiescence affords a kind of passage. The moral or ethical decision, which gathers the we enunciated in an ethical imperative, we must, into a community that holds at its heart exposure to a nothing, we will maintain, gives way to another form of affirmation. I quote, "This is why, Robert, I still have my place next to you." The latter conclusion, also giving a we of sorts, is still colored by the ethical decision that precedes, but the right or the place that it asserts is existentially defined. I draw from Heidegger in using this term, but I would prefer, if time permitted, to draw from Blanchot's reading, or rather citation, of Antelme in the second publication of Dans la nuit, surveillée. Namely, what I would like to cite for you is Antelme's evocation of the experience of shame and exposure felt by one, and by one next to him, who is chosen by sheer contingency for death. What Blanchot is describing or claiming, I believe, is a being with, or more precisely, a dying with, that he now feels empowered to claim and to draw forth in a form of writing. I am proceeding now to a rather firm interpretation of a few extremely difficult lines, so I would like to back up slightly to sketch my understanding of the passage I have briefly evoked. The passage from an account of a teaching and the lesson drawn from it, to an affirmation and then a striking reassertion and even grounding of the relation that was evoked in the opening of the text. To put this briefly, I want to emphasize that such a passage was only possible because Blanchot received Antelme's teaching in what I have termed a hospitable writing. I have tried to suggest that Blanchot found himself implicated in Antelme's account of the encounter with nothing in the infirmary. I would add or emphasize that this implication was not a matter of simple identification, if such a thing could ever be simple. It was rather that Antelme had communicated his exposure to an unfathomable void in the living presence of the other and had confided, in the French, this would be confié, had confided his understanding of the exigency that formed in this exposure. He had, in effect, related a trace of the exposure to alterity in a responsive word, a just or a true word, as Blanchot put it in his essay in L'Espèce humaine, and had given it over to the fidelity, the keeping of the other. The declaration of the concluding paragraph, Blanchot's, I want to suggest, was made in such a fidelity. It is then from this answerable response that Blanchot could claim his place next to his departing friend. Because this place forms by the writing of the other, or more precisely in a kind of relay of that writing, whereby another, Blanchot, writes in the place opened by Antelme, I believe we are perhaps justified in understanding it as comparable to the one that was evoked at the opening of the brief narrative that Blanchot offered in the pages following his meditation on the impossible necessary death in the writing of the disaster. A narrative, as you'll remember, that appears to give a kind of figuration to an experience of the event of effacement, or at least to the impossible words that transcribe it, on tue un enfant. That narrative, offered as what is perhaps a primal scene, opens as follows. I quote, "You who live later, close to a heart that beats no more, suppose this." End quote. The text, of course, goes on to describe the primal scene. The text addresses one who has lived near an event of effacement, a passing of some kind, and invites to suppose such a passing, or more precisely, a figuration of this passing. Later, in L'Écriture du désastre, Blanchot returns to the status of this supposition and states that such an act of fictioning is required because otherwise, I quote, "Speaking of the child who has never spoken, the infans, would be to draw back into history, into experience or into the real what has ruined them. History, experience, or the real. End quote. Thus, only something like supposition can entertain the effacement in question, and then what it might mean to survive this effacement. I quote again, waiting and watching. That's the survival, waiting and watching, for suddenly awakened and knowing this full well henceforth, never wakeful enough. Dans la nuit surveillée, I would argue, remains in the order of supposition, even if it affirms the right to such supposition. And I quote from the text again, "And this night watched over in which you come to see me is not an illusion where everything would disappear, but my right to make you live, even in the void I feel approaching." But is the night watched over, taking that phrase, itself an expression of this right to make the other live? The syntax of the sentence and the quotation marks themselves hint that this night is something claimed, and thus brought to some form of saying or figuration. Or does the event of this night, its fact, somehow confer the right to fiction? Again, he said, "And this night watched over, in which you come to see me, is not an illusion where everything would disappear, but my right to make you live." So my question is, has Blanchot written that night watched over, or is this what gives the right to fiction? The latter interpretation, its fact would confer the right, the fact of the night, the latter interpretation seems almost immediately compelling and almost evident. The trace of Antelme's departure or effacement has brought Blanchot this right. But it is also clear at this point in the meditation that Blanchot himself has come to assume, or is assuming, a watch in the night, that he is now writing from the place of the other. The exposure to the approaching void that Blanchot evoked in the preceding paragraph has come to found a knowledge of the night in which Blanchot sensed the approaching withdrawal of his friend. It has given him that night in the space and the time of a kind of survival, thus rendering possible the assumption and the very writing of the night watched over, a literary act, in other words. The night, attended by the trace of Robert Antelme's passing, as transcribed in the words je m'éloigne, may thus be understood as both the origin and the issue of this piece of meditative writing. It becomes the condition of the right to fiction affirmed in the text, which folds upon itself as this right is affirmed. We have here, though I offer this suggestion with great caution, a most astonishing recollection of the haunting title of Blanchot's great essay on literary language, Literature and the Right to Death. If we follow this echo, and I think we can, we are perhaps prompted to read the phrase right to death as something like the right to figure an accompaniment onto death, the right to a saying of a dying with. But I have to acknowledge that I use the word figure here with even greater reserve, because the necessary paucity of such a figuration has already been indicated to us. In this very piece of writing, it consists of no more than the exchanged words we have read. To make you live, to quote that phrase again, this is entretenir, to be sure, but in the manner of sustaining that opening to the effacing names and the impossible relation to which they summon or into which they are carried by this exchange, sustaining a relation to the anonymous and ultimately unthinkable suffering to which those names point, the effacement of that suffering. Faire vivre, that right, this is nothing more, even if it involves what he called a plenitude, than retaining relation to the effacement to which this other has afforded relation. I stress again the way Je m'éloigne opens onto a form of historical testimony on the ground of Blanchot's insistence that these words spoke not of Robert Antelme, but of what he came to bear through his experience of the camps. But Blanchot's way of introducing his understanding of la nuit surveillée also drives us in a comparable direction, beyond a merely intersubjective relation and toward a real of some kind that exceeds any singular experience. That night is not an illusion, he insists. Were it a mere dream or some comparable fantasy, we might even say fiction in the traditional sense of this term, then all would in fact be lost. The relation to Robert Antelme would be lost in a night of a different kind. We might be tempted to interpolate the assertion at this point, no, it is not an illusion, it is real, even if it is brought to us in writing. And perhaps that interpolation is not mistaken, keeping in mind all of Blanchot's wariness with regard to the term real. But we can say at least, following Blanchot, that this night is real in the manner of a legitimating condition of an act of writing, in which the entretien and the faire vivre I have described would find justification. In this night, Blanchot declares, I have a right to this commemoration and to keeping a vigil in relation to the names upon which Robert Antelme's own opens, a right to accompany the friendship even unto nothing, as Blanchot declared in the essay on Bataille. I have been given the right and the obligation to bring to language an instance of the effacement that is the abyssal ground of any true or just relation to history itself.